Here's a number that should stop every Western strategist cold: 6.3 trillion. That is where India's GDP is projected to land by 2030, according to the International Monetary Fund. Not 4 trillion, not 5 trillion, $6.3 trillion. And the most extraordinary part? That figure isn't the ceiling. That is the conservative estimate. Now let me give you a second number, one that Piers Morgan had to acknowledge on international television. Nine countries, are now actively restructuring their immigration policy, their trade corridors, their technology pipelines, and their cultural diplomacy specifically around one demographic. Not American expatriates, not Chinese investors, not European technocrats, Indians. When Piers Morgan, a man whose political instincts are calibrated for maximum provocation, sits across a camera and tells a global audience that India is the most powerful civilizational force of the 21st century, you are not watching commentary. You are watching a structural realignment being acknowledged in real time. Today, we are going inside the architecture of that realignment. This is the Strategic Intelligence Report. Let's begin. To understand why 9 separate nations are engineering their national strategy around the Indian demographic, we need to do something most media refuses to do. We need to go back to first principles. We need to ask, why now? The post-World War II global economic architecture was built on 3 load-bearing pillars: American consumption, European institutional authority, and Chinese manufacturing. For 70 years, that triangle held. But between 2008 and 2023, each of those pillars began exhibiting what economists call institutional paralysis, the inability of a system to reform itself in response to structural pressure. The United States is now carrying $34 trillion in national debt, a figure that, adjusted for GDP, represents the highest peacetime leverage in American history. The Federal Reserve's rate cycle has not solved the underlying structural problem, it has deferred it. Europe faces a deeper crisis, a manufacturing contraction. Germany, the industrial engine of the continent, recorded negative GDP growth in 2023 and again underperformed in 2024. The European energy realignment post-Ukraine didn't just raise costs, it exposed a fundamental dependency architecture that no Brussels policy paper had adequately modeled. And China? The Evergrande collapse wasn't an isolated corporate failure, it was a diagnostic signal, a structural symptom of an economy that over-indexed on construction-led growth, suppressed domestic consumption, and is now navigating a demographic cliff with a shrinking working-age population. Into this environment of converging institutional failures, one nation stepped forward, not by accident, not by luck, but because of decisions made decades ago that the West chose to ignore: India. To understand why this is a turning point, we have to look at the data they missed. The story of India's rise isn't a story about the future. It is a story about a past that was always pointing here. There are 4 structural engines driving India's global ascent, and what makes them remarkable is that they are self-reinforcing. Each one accelerates the others. Each one compounds. This is not a linear growth story. This is an exponential systems event. Engine 1, demographic dominance. In 2023, India surpassed China to become the world's most populous nation, 1.44 billion people. But raw population means nothing in isolation. The critical variable is the median age. India's median age, 28.4 years. Germany's, 46. Japan's, 49. China's, 39. India is the youngest major economy on Earth. That means India's peak productive and consumptive years, the decades when an economy generates maximum output and internal demand, lie entirely ahead of it. While the West debates how to fund aging pension systems, India is deploying the largest cohort of working-age humans in recorded history. Engine 2, digital infrastructure leapfrogging. India did not inherit legacy financial infrastructure. It built new infrastructure, from scratch, at scale, at speed, and in doing so, it bypassed the structural inefficiencies that slow Western economies. The Unified Payments Interface, UPI, now processes over 14 billion transactions per month. For context, that is more digital transactions than the United States and Europe combined. India did not copy the West's financial system. India rendered it obsolete. Engine 3, human capital export and the diaspora premium. India produces approximately 1.5 million engineering graduates per year. It graduates more STEM professionals annually than the United States and United Kingdom combined. Those graduates don't just stay in India, they disperse across the global economy. into boardrooms, into laboratories, into policy centers, and they carry extraordinary institutional leverage with them. The CEO of Google, Indian. The CEO of Microsoft, Indian. The CEO of IBM, Indian. The CEO of Adobe, MasterCard, FedEx, Palo Alto Networks, Twitter at its peak, Indian. Indian, 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 Indian. This is not a coincidence. This is the output of a civilization that treats intellectual capital as a strategic asset. Engine 4. Strategic autonomy. While Western powers demand ideological alignment as a precondition for partnership, India operates on a doctrine of strategic autonomy. It is a member of the Quad security framework alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. It simultaneously maintains deep trade relationships with Russia. It chairs the G20 with diplomatic precision. It leads the Global South through the Voice of the South Summit. India does not pick sides. India dictates the terms. Before we go deeper, if you value data-driven analysis over mainstream narratives, if you want to understand the structural forces shaping the global economy before they hit the headlines, join our community of strategic thinkers. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because the next segment reveals something that Western intelligence analysts are only now beginning to model. And it involves a corridor that will reshape global trade for the next 50 years. Don't move. Let us now decode the Piers Morgan moment, because its significance goes far beyond the surface of celebrity commentary. Piers Morgan did not arrive at his public acknowledgement of India's power through intellectual generosity. He arrived there through political pragmatism. Morgan represents a specific class of Western media operator, one whose instincts are finely calibrated to the temperature of public sentiment in Anglo-American discourse. When someone of his profile makes a declaration about Indian civilizational power, he is not leading the conversation. He is reflecting a consensus that has already formed in the rooms that matter. In the United Kingdom, Morgan's primary base, the Indian diaspora represents 1.8 million citizens. More importantly, they represent a disproportionate share of economic output, tax contribution, and institutional leadership. Rishi Sunak became the first British Prime Minister of Indian heritage, not despite Britain's institutional structure, but through it. This is what the Nine Nations data actually represents. It is not sentiment. It is not multiculturalism for optics. It is rational, strategic calculation by governments that have run the numbers. The numbers say, attract Indian talent, Indian capital, and Indian institutional intelligence, or fall behind those who do. Let's walk through the Nine Nations individually. United States. Indian Americans represent 1.3% of the U.S. population, but contribute over 6% of U.S. GDP through business ownership, technology leadership, and professional services. The H-1B visa backlog for Indian nationals exceeds 700,000 applications. The U.S. government is not restricting this pipeline. It is structurally dependent on it. United Kingdom. Beyond the Sunak precedent, the UK-India Free Trade Agreement negotiations represent the single most strategically significant bilateral trade negotiation in British post-Brexit history. The UK needs India's market of 1.4 billion consumers far more urgently than India needs any single British export category. The leverage has permanently inverted. Canada. Canada admitted over 226,000 Indian students in 2022 alone, making India the single largest source country for international education. Canada's federal immigration minister has explicitly identified Indian nationals as a priority demographic for its long-term population growth strategy. When a G7 nation restructures its demographic future around a single foreign nationality, that is not immigration policy. That is a civilizational merger by consent. United Arab Emirates. The UAE is home to 3.5 million Indian nationals, its single largest expatriate community, constituting roughly 35% of the total UAE population. Indian remittances from the UAE exceed $18 billion annually. The India-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement signed in 2022 was executed in a record 88 days, the fastest bilateral trade deal in modern history. Why so fast? Because both governments understood they were formalizing what the market had already decided. Australia. Australia's revised immigration framework has been recalibrated to specifically advantage Indian STEM graduates. India is now Australia's largest source of permanent migrants. And in the context of the Quad Alliance, where India, Australia, the US, and Japan coordinate on Indo-Pacific security, the strategic logic is obvious. Australia is binding itself to India's strategic orbit. Singapore. Singapore's model has always been to identify the highest value human capital pools in Asia and build institutional pathways for absorption. India currently represents Singapore's second largest foreign workforce. More critically, Indian technology professionals now constitute the dominant cohort in Singapore's fast-track tech talent visa program. Germany. Germany faces what its own federal government has called a skilled worker shortage crisis of 4 million positions by 2030. The German Skilled Immigration Act, reformed in 2023, was explicitly designed to remove barriers for Indian professionals. German Chancellor Scholz visited India in 2023 and signed bilateral agreements specifically targeting Indian engineering and healthcare talent pipelines. When the industrial engine of Europe is recalibrating its labor architecture around Indian output, you are watching a macroeconomic dominance event, not a talent exchange program. Japan. Japan's demographic crisis is arguably the most severe of any major economy. Its population is declining, its working-age cohort is contracting, its pension system is structurally stressed. Japan has historically maintained the most restrictive immigration posture of any G7 nation. That posture broke in 2023 when Japan introduced the J-skip visa, a highly accelerated pathway specifically engineered to attract high-skilled foreign nationals. The primary target demographic, Indian technology and engineering professionals. Japan, the most culturally closed major economy on Earth, opened its institutional door, and it opened it toward India. Netherlands. The Netherlands, as home to major European technology and logistics infrastructure, ASML, Philips, Booking.com, has become a critical node in the global Indian professional diaspora network. ASML, which manufactures the world's only EUV lithography machines, the most strategically significant technology in global semiconductor production, employs a substantial cohort of Indian-born engineers. When the company that controls the bottleneck of the global chip supply chain is operationally dependent on Indian intellectual capital, that is not a demographic statistic. That is a strategic choke point. This isn't just a trend, it's a permanent shift in the global order. And the most important part of that shift isn't happening in New Delhi. It's happening in boardrooms in Berlin, immigration offices in Ottawa, and technology labs in Tokyo. The decision has already been made. The only question is whether you understand what it means. In September 2023, at the G20 summit in New Delhi, hosted by India, something happened that received almost no mainstream media coverage. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, was formally announced. This is a rail, road, and sea corridor linking India through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, directly to European ports. It bypasses the Strait of Malacca, it bypasses the Suez dependency, and it directly challenges, structurally and economically, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative has been China's strategic masterpiece, a $1 trillion infrastructure investment connecting 140 countries to Chinese supply chains, Chinese financing, and Chinese geopolitical influence. For 15 years, no competing architecture existed. IMEC is the competing architecture, and it was announced on Indian soil under Indian diplomatic leadership. The World Bank estimates that trade corridor infrastructure of this scale can reduce bilateral trade costs by up to 40% between participating nations. A 40% reduction in trade costs between India, the Gulf, and Europe does not improve India's position. It transforms it. Simultaneously, India is executing the Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor to the east, a sea route connecting Indian ports directly to Russia's Pacific coast, opening Arctic trade lanes that geopolitical planners are only beginning to model. And the international north-south transport corridor through Iran connects Indian logistics networks to Central Asia and onward to European markets. India is not participating in trade corridors. India is architecting them. India's merchandise and services exports crossed $776 billion in FY 2023, a 14% increase in a year when global trade contracted. That is not resilience. That is structural realignment in real time. Here is a phrase that is now standard language in every Fortune 500 supply chain boardroom: China plus one. It describes the strategic imperative, accelerated by COVID supply chain collapse and US-China decoupling, to establish manufacturing capability in at least one nation outside of China. The theoretical candidates were Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Mexico. The actual winner is becoming increasingly unambiguous. It is India. Apple, the most valuable company in human history, began assembling iPhones in India in 2022. By 2024, Apple's Indian manufacturing output had scaled to represent a significant portion of global iPhone production. Tim Cook flew to India personally to oversee the strategic expansion, the same gesture of institutional commitment he had previously reserved for Beijing. When Tim Cook makes a pilgrimage, the direction of global capital is not ambiguous. The instrument driving this shift is India's Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, PLI. Launched across 14 critical sectors: electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, green energy, automobiles, textiles, the PLI framework is not a subsidy in the traditional sense. It is a performance-linked capital architecture that rewards production scale with graduated government incentives. The result: over $26 billion in committed private manufacturing investment across PLI sectors in a 3-year window. India already manufactures 20% of the world's generic medicines, a pharmaceutical leverage that was laid bare during COVID when the world discovered its biological supply chains ran through Indian factories. India's semiconductor ambitions, backed by a $10 billion government incentive package, are attracting investments from Micron Technology, Applied Materials, and a consortium of Taiwanese chipmakers seeking geopolitical diversification. To understand why this is a turning point, we need to look at the data they missed, which is that India's manufacturing emergence is not a second-tier replication of the China model. It is a fundamentally different architecture, one built on democratic institutional stability, English language integration, and a domestic consumer market of 1.4 billion people that creates internal demand loops that China is struggling to replicate. The World Bank projects India's middle class will reach 400 million people by 2030. That is a consumer cohort larger than the entire population of the United States, coming online with disposable income within the next 5 years. No external market necessary. India is building demand from within. Economic power without cultural power is temporary. Military power without narrative power is unstable. The most durable form of global dominance is what scholars call soft power, the capacity to shape global preferences, norms, and aspirations without coercion. And India's soft power architecture is executing a global leadership pivot that no Western analyst has adequately modeled. International Yoga Day, proposed by India at the United Nations, is now observed in 177 countries. Annually, simultaneously, India established this global cultural ritual through multilateral diplomacy in 2 years. That is a soft power deployment speed that the West's most well-funded cultural institutions cannot match. Bollywood is the largest film industry in the world by number of films produced. Indian cinema content now streams through Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus to audiences in every time zone on the planet. The cultural vocabulary of Indian storytelling, its emotional registers, its visual aesthetics, its thematic architecture, is becoming globalized cultural grammar. But India's soft power goes deeper than contemporary media. It goes to civilizational antiquity. India is the source civilization of yoga, Ayurveda, advanced mathematical concepts including the number zero, the decimal system, chess, and philosophical traditions that underpin significant schools of Western thought. When India steps forward in the 21st century as a global civilizational leader, it is not proposing something new, it is reclaiming something ancient. India's diplomatic positioning has executed what analysts call a civilizational rebranding at scale. The G20 New Delhi Declaration, achieved under Indian presidency in 2023, secured consensus on issues including debt relief for developing nations, climate finance, and digital public infrastructure. In a global diplomatic environment where consensus is structurally difficult, India delivered it. The African Union's inclusion in the G20, a historic institutional expansion, happened because India proposed it. Because India led the argument, because India had the credibility of the Global South, and because the Global South, 4 billion people, trusts India in a way it has never trusted any Western power. Every structural power shift generates what strategists call second-order effects, the downstream consequences that reshape systems far beyond the immediate change. India's rise is generating second-order effects that are already restructuring global systems. Let us walk through them precisely. Second-order effect 1. The dollar's reduced monopoly. India is now conducting a significant portion of its bilateral trade, particularly with Russia, UAE, and Southeast Asian partners, in non-dollar denominations. The rupee trade settlement agreements India has signed represent the most significant structural challenge to dollar hegemony since the petrodollar system was established in the 1970s. This is not India declaring war on the US financial system. This is India exercising strategic autonomy, which is precisely the doctrine it has publicly articulated. The second-order effect, Every nation watching India execute rupee trade successfully calculates whether it can do the same. The dollar's structural monopoly is being tested, and the test is being administered from New Delhi. Second-order effect 2, the redefinition of developed. India has the world's third-largest startup ecosystem by number of unicorns, over $100 billion startups. It has a space program that successfully landed a rover on the lunar South Pole, a feat no other nation, including the United States, has achieved. It is building the world's largest renewable energy infrastructure at a pace that the International Energy Agency calls unprecedented, and it is doing all of this while maintaining the world's largest democratic electoral system, 960 million registered voters, managed without institutional collapse. The definition of developed is being rewritten, and India is writing it. Second-order effect 3, the Global South realignment. For 70 years, the Global South operated within a framework where the primary capital providers, technology exporters, and institutional architects were Western powers. That framework is fracturing. India's South-South cooperation framework, providing concessional credit, technical assistance, and technology transfer to over 160 nations, is building a parallel institutional architecture. India's International Solar Alliance now has 116 member nations. India's digital public infrastructure model, built on the Open Network for Digital Commerce and the UPI architecture, is being adopted by governments from Brazil to Namibia. When India's digital infrastructure becomes the operating system of the Global South, the West does not lose relevance immediately, it loses it structurally, over a decade, permanently. This isn't just a trend, it is a permanent structural shift in the global order, and the nations that are recalibrating fastest, the 9 we identified at the start of this report, are doing so because their strategic intelligence apparatus has already run these models. The question is whether you are running them too. Strategic intelligence requires intellectual honesty. A complete analysis does not ignore friction points. India's ascent, for all its structural inevitability, must navigate real challenges. Challenge 1. Infrastructure gap. India's logistics infrastructure, roads, ports, cold chain, urban mass transit, remains significantly below the quality required for a manufacturing-led export economy of the scale India is targeting. The government's National Infrastructure Pipeline, a $1.4 trillion commitment over 5 years, is the most ambitious infrastructure spending program in Indian history. But execution speed is the variable. Ambition without execution is theater. Challenge 2. Income inequality. India's measure of income inequality remains high. The extraordinary wealth generated at the top of India's economy has not yet penetrated deep enough into rural and informal labor markets. A consumer economy requires broad-based income distribution. India must convert its demographic asset into broad purchasing power, not just elite prosperity. Challenge 3. Environmental sustainability. India is the world's third-largest carbon emitter, a function of its developmental stage and energy mix. Its commitment to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 is the most ambitious green energy pledge in the world. But coal remains a bridging fuel in the medium term. The cost of the energy transition will test India's policy architecture for decades. These are not disqualifiers. They are the friction costs of transformation at scale. Every nation that has made the transition from emerging to dominant has navigated equivalent friction. The question is not whether challenges exist. The question is whether the structural momentum overwhelms the friction. On current trajectory, it does. Let us close this report with the forecasting data, because data is not propaganda. Data is the architecture of reality. IMF projection. India becomes the world's third-largest economy by 2027, overtaking Japan and Germany simultaneously. Goldman Sachs projection. India's GDP crosses $10 trillion by 2035, at which point it becomes the second-largest economy on Earth. World Bank projection. India's share of global manufacturing rises from 3% to 10% by 2030, a tripling of structural industrial weight. Morgan Stanley projection. India's stock market becomes the world's third-largest by market capitalization before 2030, surpassing Japan. UN projection. India's working-age population will be the largest cohort of any single nation on Earth through 2055. These are not optimistic outlier scenarios. These are the central case projections of the world's most rigorous multilateral institutions. When the IMF, World Bank, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley all converge on the same structural conclusion. That is not analysis. That is consensus reality. And the 9 countries who are reshaping their immigration architecture, their trade corridors, their technology pipelines around the Indian demographic, they have read these projections. They are not acting on sentiment. They are acting on strategy. The only question left is whether you, as an individual navigating your career, your capital, your professional network, are reading the same data and making the same calculation. India is not asking for permission. It is not requesting recognition. It is not waiting for Western validation of a trajectory that its own data has already confirmed. India is executing, and every nation, every institution, every corporation that is paying attention is repositioning itself accordingly. The structural realignment is not a prediction. It is not a forecast. It is not a projection. It is already in progress. The IMF has already run the models. Goldman Sachs has already positioned the capital. 9 governments have already rewritten their immigration policy. Tim Cook has already landed in Mumbai. Piers Morgan, of all people, has already said it on camera. So here's the strategic question I want to leave you with. Not as commentary, not as rhetoric, as a genuine analytical challenge. The global economy of 2035 will be organized around a fundamentally different axis of power, capital, and institutional gravity than the one you were educated to navigate. How are you positioning yourself for that economy? Are you building skills that are relevant to the growth corridors of tomorrow, or optimizing for a system that the data suggests is in structural decline? Are you building networks that connect to the diaspora communities, the 35 million Indians across 192 countries that represent the world's single largest professional intelligence network? Are you reading the macro data or consuming the narrative that incumbent powers want you to believe? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that separate strategic actors from passive observers. And the next video we have prepared for you goes deeper. It maps the specific financial corridors, the sectoral investment architecture, and the career positioning playbook for individuals who want to operate at the intersection of India's rise and global opportunity. That video is your roadmap. Watch it next. If this report gave you a framework that your MBA didn't, hit subscribe. If you want to be part of a community of strategic thinkers who operate on data, not headlines, join us. The shift is already in motion. This has been the Strategic Intelligence Report. I'll see you in the war room.